Okay, as a start, never in my or John Zeisman's careers have, the worlds of international and transatlantic relations been so head-spinningly volatile. Obvious point, but let's start with it. The title I gave this talk recalls an earlier project that began very innocently with the purpose of specifying how much transatlantic relations changed in the transition from the Clinton to the George W. Bush administrations. And we got experts in different policy areas to start investigating that question, and then 9/11 happened. And we got those experts to European University in Florence in Italy to present their drafts, and then the invasion of Iraq took place. So that project began to feel like the wound that would never heal. But we persisted, got a book out called Europe, America, Bush, which concluded that during a time of acute political crisis in transatlantic relations, things didn't really change very much at the sort of operational policy level. That finding also confirmed in a study I led for the European Commission, which is the European Union's executive civil service, on the state of transatlantic relations after 10 years of what was called the New Transatlantic Agenda, the Clinton-era framework for exchanges between the US and EU. Despite all the political noise over Iraq and the global war on terror and the axis of evil, the worker bees just kept on working and producing sort of pragmatic, often productive, transatlantic policy cooperation, even on really tough issues, such as Homeland Security, or Afghanistan, or China's application to the World Trade Organization. And I tell you that because we now live in a world where a president might today, has it happened yet, launch military strikes in Syria that maybe result in collateral deaths of Russian military personnel. Why? Well, in his own mind, above all maybe to get ahead of Stormy Daniels in the news cycle. And we've got John Bolton, maybe the most Neanderthal, hard-boiled, anti-European, unapologetic, neoconservative in the Bush administration as U.S. National Security Advisor. But even in our crazy world, history tells us that usually there's more continuity than change in U.S. foreign policy and in transatlantic relations, even when a U.S. administration of one political tribe replaces that of the other. And to illustrate, the U.S. military response, which could come any time now to the chemical weapons attack in Syria, will likely be a multilateral one with France and the UK. So when we ask where we're headed, whether we're headed for a sort of post-American, post-liberal, post-transatlantic era, we can look to A, history, B, the current crisis of liberal democracy, C, Trump's own world view, such as it is, and the power of civil society, both domestically and internationally, for evidence about what and how much has changed and will change about international and transatlantic relations. Drawing on evidence from those four sources, I want to make a theoretically informed argument about the relative power of structure versus agency in international and transatlantic relations, which is in the piece in the JEI, right? Yeah. Sometimes I can't remember what I said where. And refine the question a little bit to, is the liberal international order and transatlantic relations as one of its core elements resilient and durable enough to accommodate shifts in global power and to accommodate change agents such as Donald Trump, who challenged the status quo without disintegrating altogether? Now, according to most international relations theory, structure trumps agency. No pun intended. For realists, the distribution of power between states in the international system is really all that matters. That distribution of power creates a structure that bears down hard on agents and limits their agency. Kenneth Waltz's neorealism is an extreme case. He says all states are functionally similar. They all want the same thing. They want more power and more security. And thus, their internal characteristics drop out of any theoretical explanation. States are literally, as he put it, billiard balls, jockeying for position. Agency matters. States do act, especially to maximize their power, but structure trumps agency in terms of causation. Liberal IR theorists give us a different take. They say international organizations and alliances and law qualify the anarchy that realists insist is the dominant logic of international relations. And the result is what John Eikenberry, who's a leading liberal IR theorist, calls a quasi-constitutional international order that features more cooperation than conflict. But again, causation is structural. The liberal international order constrains states and states' persons and is more durable than realists realize. On the other hand, we get constructivists and foreign policy analysts who allow a lot of scope for the ability of agents to make choices that not only determine international outcomes, but sometimes reshape the structural conditions faced by future policymakers. Recall Alexander Wendt, leading constructivist, in his argument that anarchy is what states make of it. Meanwhile, foreign policy analysis focuses on foreign policy decision-making. The structure of the international system matters, but mostly in how it is perceived in the minds of foreign policy makers and how it shapes their agency. And these debates about structure and agency, they're not purely theoretical. Even before Trump's election, or the shock decision of my adopted country to leave the European Union, a lot of our best minds were agreeing that we were witnessing a global power shift away from the West to China, but also to the other BRIC states. Everybody knows what we mean by BRIC?
No.
No. So somebody tell us. Brazil, Russia, India, China. Sometimes including South Africa, sometimes not.
South Africa's the S, right?
What?
South Africa's the S, right?
Yes, correct.
South Africa's.
Well, it could be a small S or a big S. Never mind. The BRICS. Okay? Richard Haass, senior Bush administration official, argues that a new world disorder is arising from how power is more distributed in more hands than at any time in history. I think that's a claim as much or more about power shifting away from states to other actors as power shifting between them, but never mind. It certainly doesn't imply that the liberal international order or the transatlantic alliance are all that durable. Separate but related matter. Is the liberal international order malleable enough to accommodate the rise of the BRICS of non-Western powers while ensuring stability, predictability, conflict resolution? Can it bend without breaking? Well, you know what? We might conclude that some emerging powers have recently pursued their interests very aggressively. Think of Russia in Crimea or Syria. Think of China in the South China Sea. Maybe because they calculate they can get away with it without threatening the international order itself, from which they benefit in various ways. And if that's true, it's dangerous for two reasons. Miscalculations. When the intentions of powerful states are misread by others and states stumble into conflict. Second, there's a risk that those who value the liberal international order are going to focus overmuch on Trump without seeking to preserve and reinforce that order. Okay, I'm going to shift a little bit, hopefully not too abruptly. Let's think about Donald Trump's world view. Quoting Richard Haass again, Trump took full advantage of, quote, a widespread rejection of globalization and international involvement, and a questioning of long-standing postures and policies ranging from openness to trade and immigrants to a willingness to maintain alliances and overseas commitments. And Trump, in so doing, rejected isolationism by promising sort of kick-ass activism that would put America first and make it a winner when its interests clash with those of others. Now, if we leave aside defense spending, big exception, because it's set to reach record levels next year, Trump promised to do all this on the cheap, such as by somehow getting Mexico to pay for a border wall, and making drastic cuts to the State Department. And while all his bluff and bluster obscures his core foreign policy beliefs, I think three are clear. One, U.S. allies, including European ones, owe America vast sums of money for past and present U.S. security guarantees. Second, Trump is a committed protectionist who has opposed every post-war U.S. trade agreement and actually believes that trade wars are easy to win. He believes that. Third, he personalizes the political. And he makes no secret of his admiration for authoritarian strongmen like Russia's Putin and China's Xi and Egypt's El-Sisi. So, plenty of scope there to disrupt international and transatlantic relations. But let's just note some sources of constraint on Trump. One is international organizations and alliances. Trump's saber rattling on North Korea. I don't know about you, but I found it terrifying. But in practice, the administration has mostly worked through the UN and bilaterally with China on North Korea. Even on NATO, it shocked even Trump's own advisors when he turned up to dedicate the memorial to the victims of 9/11 at NATO's new headquarters in Brussels, and he never once mentioned America's commitment to NATO's Article 5, which stipulates that attack on one member state is an attack on all NATO member states. The only time it was ever invoked was, guess when? 9/11. But NATO is undergoing a kind of quiet rebirth. European defense spending is up considerably. NATO has created multiple new command centers, including one on maritime operations following Europe's refugee crisis, and the logistics of moving troops and material quickly across Europe following Crimea and all kinds of Russian military mischief, as well as on cybersecurity. Second source of constraint is the foreign policy power of Congress. What happens to the Iran nuclear deal is unknowable, but it ultimately will be Congress that will keep it or kill it. And besides, there are things the other parties to the agreement, including European ones, plus Russia, plus China, can do to keep it alive, which speaks to that first constraint. Then there's the broader U.S. foreign policy community. What my colleague, the arch-realist John Mearsheimer, calls the blob. Very scientifically, Mearsheimer argues that there's almost no difference of outlook between Democratic and Republican foreign policy professionals, and most tend to be very cautious and conservative. And besides, you may know there are a staggering number of political foreign policy positions that remain unfilled under Trump. There is no U.S. ambassador to Egypt. There is no U.S. ambassador to South Korea. There is no U.S. ambassador to the European Union. I actually was asked if I was interested. Can you imagine? Yeah, sure, I want to spend 4 years going, well, what the president meant to say was... But anyway, that conservatism is reinforced because non-political officials are still keeping political seats warm. Now, the power of the blob has been weakened as able, reasonable, professional people like Herbert McMaster, Rex Tillerson, I don't know if you want to count him, Gary Cohn, have left the administration, and we get headbangers like John Bolton and Mike Pompeo and Peter Navarro, who have been elevated in influence. Speaking of Navarro, author of comical works with titles like Death by China. Trade policy is one of those areas where Trump is least constrained. And after his approval rating dipped to new lows and Democrats made gains in Republican strongholds like Alabama and Pennsylvania, Trump fell back on his protectionist instincts and started a trade war with China, amongst others. With Trump's political advisors judging his domestic agenda to be pretty much stalled following tax reform, deciding to let Trump be Trump A trade war, you know, may energize Trump's political base, but it's certainly, I promise you, it is not going to create more American jobs. Steel-using industries employ something like 80 times more Americans than does the U.S. steel-producing industry. And anytime the existing international order gets disrupted, there are always unintended consequences. For example, two winners from Trump's trade war may well be Brazil and China. Brazil, because their soybean producers will replace U.S. producers in capturing China's huge domestic market. And China, which is going to get a geographical or geopolitical foothold in Latin America, especially for its own exporters, which is a stated Chinese policy goal. Now, I'm going to pivot again, hopefully not too abruptly, and share a few thoughts on where the EU has recently got to and what it means for transatlantic relations. Europe, the EU, has been through the worst, most existentially threatening period in its history. George Soros reckoned that it was facing only five crises at once by 2015 on migration, the euro, Greece, Ukraine, and Brexit. Brexit is Britain's referendum on EU membership. Britain exit Brexit, get it? You know, no system of government is good at solving multiple crises at once, let alone one as convoluted as the European Union. But living in Brussels most of this year, there's a feeling that the EU is back on track. That was the theme of the annual Ideas Lab of the Center for European Policy Studies, that Akasemi kindly mentioned where I'm based. That's a big event on the Brussels, you know, political policy calendar. Living in Scotland, as I usually do, you would think that Brexit was taking up all the political oxygen in Brussels and in the EU, but that is not the case. The EU has delegated the Brexit negotiations, which are very complicated, very onerous, to a small contingent of the Commission under the former French Foreign Minister, Michel Barnier, and the EU has shown surprising solidarity in those negotiations, and it's just getting on with other things, such as a possibly major move on defense, free trade agreements with Japan, Vietnam, other states in Asia, and data protection. Mark Zuckerberg's apology tour has put the EU's general data protection regulation in the news even in this country. The EU's economy outgrew the American economy last year, and unemployment in Europe is at a 9-year low. But excuse me, Europeans tend, in my experience, to over-celebrate good news, which is maybe understandable after you've survived so many crises. And the rise of populist anti-EU parties, leaving aside wins for mainstream parties in France and Netherlands recently, the rise of populism in Europe has been relentless. Most recently in Italy, of course. Traditionally one of the most pro-EU countries, and post-Brexit, the third largest EU member state, where Eurosceptic parties won more than half the vote last month. On one hand, the EU has adjusted to the Trump era, you might say, and Russian adventurism by committing itself in its 2016 global strategy to the idea of strategic autonomy, as well as, again, making potentially serious moves on defense. And regardless of who is in the White House, it is the European Union, it is not NATO, that is the real policy factory on issues that matter in transatlantic relations, like financial regulation and homeland security or sanctions on Russia. On those and other issues, the worker bees keep working, regardless of any noise at the highest political levels, especially through exchanges that have now existed for 23 years under the terms of the new transatlantic agenda. But you know, the lead EU official on transatlantic relations in their European External Action Service, which now sort of acts and feels like a real EU foreign ministry, told me recently that the NTA, the new transatlantic agenda, it's kind of a historical artifact now. No one ever mentions it. And the formally twice annual summits between the US President and Cabinet and the EU now take place in the margins of NATO meetings, if they take place at all. In 2010, Spain held the rotating presidency of the EU Council of Ministers, where each member state has a seat, and they were preparing to host Obama for an NTA summit in Madrid when they heard via the media that Obama wasn't coming because he hadn't found previous EU meetings useful. Too many hands to shake, too many photos to take in an EU of 28. So 3 things here. 1, the new transatlantic agenda shows you just can't institutionally engineer partnership in international relations. Almost never do sovereign states engage in exchanges on, let alone coordinate, foreign policy strategy. In that study of the NTA I worked on back in 2005, we urged the EU to try to initiate truly strategic discussions with Washington about how to pool resources to respond to things like the rise of China or climate change or international terrorism. Surprisingly, our advice was ignored. Second, there is quite a lot of disillusion with Europe and EU in Washington, and it was there before Trump got elected. Obama made no secret of how disappointed he was with Europe on Libya, on Syria, and especially the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, or TTIP, which he thought was going to be a real legacy of his presidency, and in which he invested prime political real estate by announcing the start of TTIP negotiations in his 2013 State of the Union address. TTIP never really got anywhere, mostly, I would argue, because of Europe's inability to make meaningful concessions, which kind of led Obama to become disinterested in trying to really push the US regulatory agencies to embrace regulatory convergence with Europe, which is where the additional jobs and growth from TTIP would have been possible. So again, more continuity than change, and more than we sometimes appreciate, even in the transition from Obama to Trump. And the wider international order, if we agree that the transatlantic alliance is one of its core elements, showing signs of wear and tear even before Trump got elected. Third point, I'd argue the biggest reason why Trump's election makes a difference in transatlantic relations is that he has no instinctive affinity for leaders of other democracies. Again, he likes authoritarians. And for example, he thinks it would be great if he could replicate China's President Xi in engineering his own presidency for life and American democracy with Trump characteristics. Okay, let's conclude and try to pull all this together. Transatlantic relations are sort of at a crossroads, but so are the liberal international order and Western democratic politics, and I think all those crossroads are intertwined. All 3 need renewal of a kind very hard to imagine with Trump in the White House, except, maybe ironically, at the level of American democratic politics. Even though poll margins have narrowed ahead of the midterms later this year, I'm really struck by how Democrats recently have mobilized their vote in places like Alabama and Virginia and Pennsylvania and elsewhere, and by the rise of the Indivisible movement, the grassroots progressive network of local chapters originally started by former Democratic Party congressional staff who are vibrant, even in reliably red states like Wyoming and Idaho, and who've partnered with other progressive movements in, for example, supporting young activists following the Parkland, Florida massacre. Democrats seem to be coming out of their post-Hillary malaise. And we could imagine, I could imagine, a winning coalition of young, especially minority, especially female voters, both in November and then in 2020 when Trump seeks re-election. On the Republican side, we might, I'm not promising you on this one, we might see a resurgence of moderates in the next 2 elections, even though the primary system limits that, because a lot of Republicans will decide to distance themselves from Trump. The renewal of Western democratic politics that I'd suggest is needed to preserve, let alone strengthen, both the transatlantic alliance and liberal democratic order is actually more imaginable to me in this country than it is in most countries in Europe. Thank you.